Hello and welcome to our presentation. My name is Yevgen Bogodistov, and I can make this presentation on behalf of myself and my colleagues Lyubov, Stafyeyeva and Guido Perscheid. Together, we conducted an empirical study about micro-credentialing systems. And we call this study the price of progress because mainly we looked at the indirect or social costs of digitization. And just to understand what we meant by this, you have to read the paper by Bogodistov and Oster in 2019, who applied a discrete choice experiment, a very interesting methodology, to investigate the indirect costs of digitization. Because each time we want to digitize something, each time we want to implement a new system, for instance, in a higher education institution, for taking care of the micro-credentials, we are going to face several costs. And the theory says that we have at least three types of costs in the implementation stage. In other stages, we have different other types of costs. But focusing on the implementation stage, we have the following costs: the organizational costs, costs for adjustment of security infrastructure. We have the HR-related costs because every time you install a new system, you need also to find new personnel, you need to train different personnel, different skills at existing staff, and so on. And we have relational costs. Each time you do something with this system, it has impact on your partners, especially in the higher education institutions. They have to work with different other universities, they have to work with the state, maybe with the federal state, and in this event we have to be sure that all the costs, that all the systems are compatible and the additional costs will not appear. We also wanted to add something from the prospect theory. And if you know the prospect theory, it postulates that we perceive the gain and loss differently. So the gain is not automatically the minus sign of a loss, and people perceive loss at least as twice as more impactful than the gain. And that is why we were thinking also about what is the perception of costs if we frame this new system, this micro-credentialing system, as a promising or as a risky decision. And as you know, it is more or less the same, because you can focus on the 10% of projects that fail or on 90% of projects that succeed. And actually it is the same 100%. So the 10% of projects that fail is the same as 90 that succeeded. And we wanted to know what will happen if we frame the information in this type. And that is why we came up with the two research questions. The first one was, how do indirect or social costs impact the willingness to implement blockchain-powered micro-credential systems? And the second research question is, to what extent the framing of digital transformation, this gain or loss frame, will impact the willingness to accept indirect costs. We have different types of costs that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And we decided to make a combined design of a between groups experiment, randomized experiment, and discrete choice experiment, which is an interesting methodology because on the one hand side, we have the manipulation where before people start participating in the study, they get into the frame, into this way of thinking about digital solution that is risky or digital solution that is secure, kind of just how many projects succeeded or how many projects failed. And if we have the 100% of projects, then we know that if 10 succeed, 10%, then 90% probably fail. And the second thing that we did is a discrete choice experiment where we showed people a combination of different aspects related to this digital solution, to this micro-credentialing system, blockchain-powered micro-credentialing system. And we wanted to see how will they perceive these different costs. Because if we understand the value, how these clients, these final users value it, we'll understand what are the main hurdles. And if the price is or the costs are very low, it is not a hurdle at all. And the manager, in our event, the higher education institution manager, can focus on those things that are perceived as more costly for the users. And following the suggestions by Bogodistov and Oster in 2019, we implemented the three types of costs: organizational costs, human costs or HR-related costs, and relational costs. It means costs for the third parties. And a discrete choice experiment is a type of conjoint analysis where you show people two different options with different aspects there. We have two solutions. This is the one solution regarding your new micro-credentialing system at your university, and here's the second solution. And these solutions have different descriptions, and this is the manipulation. The description solution is the manipulation. And based on what kind of decision people make, we can understand what kind of preferences they have regarding each of these aspects. And we ask people to make 10 decisions, what you can see on the slide. So, manipulation of gain and loss, and then discrete choice experiment showing different options. To understand what we showed them, I want to show you what we actually manipulated in discrete choice experiment. As you see, we have 3 types of costs: organizational, HR-related or personnel costs, and relational costs. And for each of these costs, we find a kind of reflection. What is exactly what do we mean by this? For instance, for organizational costs, it can be a reorganization of company resources. For instance, support services for new and existing users, because each time you install a new system for micro-credentialing, you will also have to install some support services for this one, which means application of resources and which means a kind of reorganization of your higher education institution. Or it can be a temporary disruption of certification process, because if we install a new system, we will have to stop using the old one and switch to the new one, which is also a challenging thing. So as you see, each of these groups of costs, we call it the attribute, organizational costs, consist of different levels. And we have the levels as a 0 level, no costs, because it can happen that the system causes no costs. And this makes us a good reference value that we can compare the cost that person has seen with a no cost. And we also use the scalable variable, as you can see here, implementation time in months. How many months will it take to implement the system? And we suggested the range from 4 to 12 months with a step of 1. And this is an equivalent of a payment. Using statistical tools, we can then calculate what is the value in months. We can calculate it as a value as a logistic coefficient, but logistic coefficients are hard to interpret. But you can convert logistic coefficients, as you have all different attributes, into a different logistic coefficient, which in this event can be converted into months. So we have a kind of willingness to trade or willingness to pay in months for a certain cost. This is how an experiment looks like. This is an example of the combination. As you see, for organizational costs, we have the additional cost for certification system and temporary disruption of certification processes. For HR-related costs, we have additional HR costs, for instance, hiring new types of personnel with expertise in technology. You might need them if you want to install a blockchain-powered microsystem, a micro-credentialing system. And here we have the cost for monitoring and analysis, which means, for instance, learning analytics, statistics, and so on. And in the next decision, the participant will see a different combination of this stuff, and each time she or he has to select which of the solutions he or she would prefer. And in this event, after we have several decisions, we can understand what are the preferences of a person regarding different attributes and different levels. And they are completely randomized, where coincidentally shown we have a tool for this develop this experiment that will appear always in the new or in the completely new constellations. So theoretically, if you run this system with several people, you can understand what are the preferences on average of the typical user of a micro-credentialing system, and we focus on the workers from the higher education institution to understand what they think about it. And I want to show you some of the results that my colleagues are going to present live for you at the conference. For instance, the HR-related costs. You see our reference value is no costs, and you see how much do we have to pay, what is the value actually for people to accept different other types of costs. For instance, the training for staff and users is costly, but not as costly as additional HR costs for hiring new personnel. For instance, if the system has this issue, people would like to have the system to be installed much earlier, so they want to have it much faster. Otherwise, you see the value in the months is 2.44 months, and if they have to wait for this 2.44 months, they will be pretty dissatisfied. But you can see that the most costly one is the additional HR-related cost. So this is the one that is perceived as most costly by users, which goes in line with what we observe in the market, at least in Europe, where we conducted the study. We have the huge deficit of personnel, and especially at the higher education institution, because they are paid not perfectly, not as in the real business. And that is why it's probably felt at all the levels, and you can see that people see that the projects will fail if you need to find additional personnel, but they might not fail if you need to train the staff. So these costs are much lower than this one, and if I were an HEI, so Higher Education Institution Manager, I would assume that in this event I really have to take care. I need to find a system that has the minimum cost, that will need as few as possible of new personnel whom I have to hire, new people whom I have to hire, because it might be an organizational hurdle. Then we have the organizational costs. As you see, they are all more or less equally important. The least important is the adjustment of security infrastructure. Still, as you see, the differences are minor, but the most important one is the additional cost for certification system management. We assume that universities are really afraid of another management system. We have already learning management systems, we have the management information systems, and additional systems seem to be kind of one of the biggest hurdle what I see. But again, all these aspects are perceived almost equally, as you can see. Then we have the relational costs, and you see that here the biggest hurdle would be transaction fees for students. It can happen that those people who responded in our questionnaire, that they were mostly thinking about the students first, which almost always happens at the university, at least in Europe, that we think about how to make the students more comfortable. And if we see that there are additional fees, in Europe usually you pay much lower for education, it's a kind of almost completely sponsored by the state. So each additional fees is something where we are all very sensitive, and we know the students will have a problem with it. It will hold for different other countries, but with a different extent, because it will depend on the size of the fees. If you pay a tuition fee is very huge, then a small fee on top of it might not be so important. But at least in Germany, in Austria, in the UK, it was important. And now I want to show you the effects of framing. Before I show the results of framing, I want to pay attention to the fact that we analyzed only the first 3 rounds of decisions. What we have noticed during the data analysis is the effects of framing, they disappear. People get into this state of gain or loss thinking, but with every additional decision, they forget about it. That's why we focused, I think, on the first 3 decisions where the effects were most powerful. And that is why the files, these lines can deviate from those that you saw on average, because we had like the analysis on average and then in 2 different frames separately. And you can see here already that there are differences, and you see that people in the loss domain, loss group, they perceive the cost not as high regarding organizational costs, maybe due to the negative expectations anyway regarding the success of the project. But we see a big shift here. We see that here, actually, in the HR-related costs, the gain group sees them as lower than the loss group. And look at this one. Training for staff is seen almost positive, as almost equal to no cost. People don't even take it into account. But in the loss domain, there's a huge difference. They have the value of this one, which is 5 times higher than the gain group, which is, I think, very important. If you want to know the statistical significance of this difference between the groups, you have to look in our paper. We have the table at the end with all the results and all the significances. And here are the relational costs. As you see, we have here kind of crossing, and you see that some costs are perceived by the gain domain as lower. For instance, transaction fees for students. Though those who are in gain domain, they are more positive regarding the cost for students. And those who are in loss domain, they are more negative. And vice versa, cost for maintaining adherence to standards and regulations seems to be a problem for those who are in gain domain, maybe because it goes at odds with the positive perception of the project, of the success of the project. But it is less costly perceived in the loss domain. Again, if you want to know more information, we present only some of the results. We recommend you reading our paper. And actually, that was it. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you will enjoy the same presentation held by my colleagues at the Academy of Management. See you, and bye-bye.